See y'all. Yes. By the way, we will be recording this talk for the sake of uploading into our YouTube channel. That way we can go reference it in future occasions. If you feel uncomfortable, we just ask that you turn off your camera and your microphone. Um, if not, feel free to ask questions as we proceed. Of course, if that's okay with Lisa. So yeah, let's go ahead and move on, right? So myself, my name is Brian Samaripa Roman. I'm a sixth-year grad student out here at the University of Central Florida, but on the way out, so I'm finishing up. I'm the representative for GPER, which is the topical group under APS for PER people. My term is ending at the end of this year, and we're actually moving on to elections. So hopefully y'all get to vote in that. Anyways, but we formed PERCoGS, myself, Danny, Diana Shazan-Pasidi, Devin Schaefer, and Hannah Sable. We're all PERCoGS, and Lisa actually, our guest, was our past president. So it's great to have her back in our space. So that's a little bit about PERCoGS, right? With the PER consortium of graduate students, we hope to voice your concerns to other people in the community, that being GPER, right, and PERLOC, right, which is the PER Leadership Organization Council, I believe, or something like that. But anyways, that's a little bit about us. Let's go ahead and move on. This is our virtual symposium. We're pretty much bringing this to the community that we as students, we can learn more about how people that have gone through through the steps that we're going through, right? People that have just recently graduated and have started their careers, and how they implemented their methods and how we can learn about them, right? So for this third episode, we have Lisa Goodhew, recent grad for the University of Washington, right now is at Seattle Pacific University. Thank you so much for being here. You're going to be talking to us about students' conceptualization of success, if I understand that correctly. So without further ado, I would just like to open up the floor for us to give a warm welcome to Lisa. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you. So yeah, go ahead. You may take the floor.
Well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk through this. I think it was like a really instructive opportunity for me to actually come up with this talk, because often I think we at conferences and things like that end up giving talks that are directed towards presenting the results. Like, here's the thing I found out, and here's how I want you to interpret this result. Whereas for this one, I really tried to make clear like what the methods are that I often use in my research, and kind of like what I've learned about those through my experience of graduate school and a little bit of research on either end of that experience. And so this was really different because it's focused not so much on the results. I will like talk a little bit about some results I've come across as an example of like how I did the research, but my goal here is to kind of talk about how I did the research, and hopefully that is useful to you as you're thinking about designing your own research programs or studies or things like that. And I absolutely do not think of myself as an expert in these methods. So I really welcome you to kind of like push back or ask questions or add your own thoughts as we're going along. I think that for me, the premise of this talk is that it is helpful to hear other people articulate their methods for the purpose of me articulating my own methods, such that I could like put them in a paper, describe them and justify them, and talk about the choices I made as I was doing the research. So yeah, I have tried to make this presentation explanatory and put the references in that have helped me learn about these methods that I'm using. So it's definitely not an exhaustive list of references. And there are probably more that I could give you if you are interested in a specific thing. So feel free to reach out if you have questions about references or like examples of some kind of research or something like that. And before I really get started in this, I just want to acknowledge that I have a number of collaborators, some of whom I see here today, who I have obviously shared these methods with pretty much from the beginning, and in particular, Amy Robertson, Paula Heron and Rachel Schur have been people who have really mentored me through learning these methods. And so I'm talking about them as though they're mine because I don't want to put words into other people's mouths. But I just want to say that these are really, in my life, they're really shared amongst a lot of people. So mine is kind of maybe not the right word. Anyways, I'll go ahead and get started. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an outline of what I want to talk about today and some of the context for what I'm talking about. My research that I have done so far, particularly my dissertation research, focused on characterizing students' conceptual resources. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And then designing and testing instructional materials that help instructors elicit students' resources and build on them in classrooms. And so today I want to talk first about how resources theory informs my research, because I think thinking about how your theoretical background or framing influences the methods that you use and the conclusions that you make is a really instructive and important piece of designing or articulating the steps in your research. And as I was thinking about the other stuff, that became clear that it wouldn't really make sense without talking about how I see resources theory informing my work. So I'll talk about that first. And then one of the big pieces of the research that I do is looking at large numbers of written responses to physics questions and kind of characterizing what students are saying there and trying to understand what the little ideas that are useful for them in those responses are. So I'll talk about some of the methods I use for characterizing lots of written data. I often construct what we call emergent coding schemes, and then there's a lot of like the kind of quantitative piece of it is talking about the iterator agreement when we do the coding scheme. So I'll talk about that. And then I have also used a lot of video data to kind of get at the details of what's going on with either students' resources or the instructional materials. And I think that's kind of there's a lot that you can do with video research, and I'll kind of talk about my experience. I'm for sure not an expert in video research, but I think I have learned from really well-known people who do a lot of video research. And so I just wanted to kind of present my experience learning that. Yeah. So first, how does the theory inform my work? So in order to answer that question, I want to give you a brief overview of how I conceptualize the resources theoretical framework. And basically, how I think of it is across the literature, generally speaking, there's some, differences among different authors. Resources are thought of as cognitive units. They exist in the minds of individual students. So this is a cognitivist theory rather than thinking about the social stuff that's going on. And resources are activated in context-sensitive ways, and often folks identify the context as just like anything about the situation or the learner that might contribute to activating those resources and making them relevant for the moment. So that's a pretty broad thing. And resources theory really emphasizes that these cognitive units or pieces of knowledge are sensible. Like there's a good reason for thinking them applicable when you do. And they are fruitful for scientific thinking. So resources kind of orients towards how students' ideas can be fruitful or productive rather than how students' ideas can be misconceptions or difficulties or kind of obstacles to be overcome in learning. And these papers here at the bottom are kind of some of my favorites that talk more about this theory if you're interested. And so when I am thinking about the research that I do, I think there are a couple of really significant ways that the resources framework guides my attention or the methods that I use. First, because we are thinking of student thinking in terms of pieces of knowledge or cognitive units that are sensible and potentially fruitful, we spend a lot of time, we work really hard to understand what students mean by what they say. We're trying to really get at the root of what are the pieces of knowledge that I am observing in this written response or in this video or something like that. Which I think is a little bit different than if I was just trying to characterize whether this response is correct or incorrect, or if I was trying to think about social interactions and how those influence students' perceptions of what's going on in the classroom or something. We're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what the students mean by what they're saying. The second thing that I think really comes out of the resources theoretical framework is in a lot of the coding schemes that I'm constructing or the video research that I'm doing, I spend a lot of time looking for the connections between what students are saying or what I think they mean or what I infer they mean and canonical physics ideas. And I think for me, that's most influenced by this expectation that students' ideas are fruitful for physics thinking. So I'm looking for the ways in which students' ideas might be seeds of science, and trying to kind of find the balance between understanding what students are saying and seeing how that could look like a physics idea. And then the third thing that I really see resources theory doing for the work that I do is we expect that resources are context sensitive. And so when we are reporting, for example, percentages of, students use X resource 60% of the time or something, we typically break those up into a specific question that we asked and report percentages per institution where we asked the question or something, rather than aggregating all that together, because we don't necessarily expect that it's going to be the same or even a similar pattern across those different contexts. And this also suggests to us that it's really important to pay attention to the demographic information of the samples that we're sampling from, because we don't really know a priori what features of context actually matter for resource activation. And so we have to anticipate that there might be differences depending on all kinds of things about our students. And so, yeah, anyways, I think I would summarize this by saying that the theoretical framework for me really helps guide the assumptions that I'm making as I'm choosing methods and choosing kind of what to pay attention to in the data. It's like a set of guiding principles for doing that. So one of the main pieces of at least my dissertation research was sort of this large and qualitative-ish research. I say qualitative-ish because I think it was mostly qualitative. We're looking for, qualities of things rather than numbers, although there's definitely some numbers. That's why I say ish. And so an example research question that I might answer in this way is, what are the common conceptual resources that students use to reason about mechanical wave propagation or, X physics topic? And usually the process for doing that looks something like this. First, we would ask a bunch of conceptual physics questions at a bunch of different universities and collect the data, of course. And then we start to analyze it first by constructing an emergent coding scheme based on the subset of the data. I'll go into a little more details because there's a lot that goes into that. And then we'll test that coding scheme that we've come up with and revise it through discussion. Often this is done with like 2 researchers or with a team of researchers that I'm working with. We're kind of discussing, does this really capture what we're seeing in the data? And when I actually try to apply it to the data, does it make sense? Am I running into a lot of gray areas or rabbit holes or that kind of thing? That's usually how I know when the coding scheme isn't quite working, is when I run into a lot of questions of, is it this, or I feel like it could be both, or this just isn't distinguishing well among different things that students are saying. Once we feel like we've tested it and revised it and have a pretty functional coding scheme, then the way that my team has done it is 2 independent coders will apply the scheme to the full data set. There are different ways that you could do this that doesn't necessarily involve 2 people coding all of the responses that you have, which for us has been like hundreds or thousands. Pretty time intensive, but and then once the two people have independently coded everything, we will calculate an inter-rater agreement and then decide how we want to report final percentages. And I'll talk a little bit about that step as well, because it's kind of involved. But back to the emergent coding scheme. So I would characterize this process as looking at a subset of the data and articulating the common themes that I see in the data. And of course, this is influenced by my theoretical perspective of I am looking for pieces of knowledge that may be fruitful for physics learning. And often what this process looks like in practice at the beginning is I just choose the first 10 responses from every data set that I've got, and I look through them and just kind of coarsely paraphrase what I think the students are saying or what ideas they think they're using. And then when I've got a whole list of the different ideas, at a certain point you start to be like, okay, I've seen this one before. Then we'll start to discuss and collapse them into like smaller categories. And as we're doing that process, what we're really looking for is we're trying to find a balance between, you know, how these ideas match with canonical physics models and concepts, and how these ideas capture the meaning that students are really making with what they're saying. And we hope that the resource codes that we construct in this process kind of fit in the intersection between those two. That's what it means to us to capture like the resource. So for example, this process might result in a coding scheme with 3 codes. These are some from my dissertation research, which was about mechanical wave propagation. We found 3 resources that we saw students using pretty commonly. One was students were saying that the medium that the pulse is propagating in has properties that either impede or facilitate its motion. The speed or duration of transverse motion affects pulse speed, or the speed of the pulse is affected by its kinetic energy. And so then I would take this 3-code scheme, essentially set up a spreadsheet, and then say, like, assign, look at every response in the data set, say whether it is 1 or 2 or 3 of these things or none of them. And another researcher would do the same thing where we're not talking to each other about that. Once we've both done that process, then it gets to the point where we want to test our agreement, and we want to know kind of, is this coding scheme reliable, or is it just like I'm sort of randomly assigning these codes based on my whims? I don't think that in a rater agreement, I don't think it's really fair to say that this is asking the question of, is this an objective coding scheme, or would another researcher who doesn't know anything about this be able to apply the same coding scheme and get the same results? Because I think that this process really is influenced by the conversations that we've had in the construction of the coding scheme, and our own physics knowledge and sort of attention towards resources and that sort of thing. However, by establishing some sort of inter-rater agreement that kind of assures your audience that you've got something here that's not just a whim, and I'm like totally downplaying this. It's more rigorous than that. But what I'm trying to do in this process is convince somebody that you may not have picked out the same codes before, but now that I have explained to you what these codes are and described these resources to you, you agree with me that what I'm seeing in the data is visible there. Essentially, I'm trying to show you what I'm seeing and have that make sense. And then the inter-rater agreement process is kind of backing that up and adding another level of rigor to that process. And there are a couple of different ways that I've done this inter-rater agreement piece in my research. One is with some kind of kappa statistic. For my research, it's been Cohen's kappa, which is a statistical measure that you can like plug in your coding spreadsheets into some kind of R workbook, and it will spit out a number for you. I won't go into the mathematical details because it's rather complicated, but kind of the advantages of Cohen's kappa is this is an established statistical measure of inter-rater reliability. Cohen's kappa is specifically for 2 raters. If you have more than 2, then there's other variations of it, basically. And it takes into account chance agreement. So it basically looks at how often each coder is assigning codes and whether it's likely that they would agree randomly based on that. Cohen's kappa assumes that your codes are independent, which I take to mean that if I assign some response one code, it's not more likely to also be another one of my codes, per se. And I feel like for the resources that I'm looking at, that's kind of a tenuous assumption sometimes, because one piece of resources theory is that resources might be activated together, or activating one resource might influence another resource to be activated. So I don't know that we can necessarily take them to be independent, which is one reason that I haven't always used this measure in my research. Cohen's kappa also, in my experience at least, applies to individual codes. So I'd have to come up with an agreement measurement or a kappa number for each individual code. And then usually I would report an average, like our kappa measurements for this coding scheme with 5 codes was an average of 0.8 or something like that. Cohen's kappa has the advantage of having published standards as to what counts as good agreement. Like you can find papers that will say if you've got a kappa of 0.85 and above, that's excellent agreement. However, these do not seem to really be based on anything like data-driven. So that is another reason that some people don't like Cohen's kappa. Is Cohen in his original paper published like, these would probably be good agreements, but he doesn't give any justification for that. However, it's kind of at the point where there are like accepted standards in the field. Anyways, another option that I've gone with for some of those reasons is just calculating a percentage agreement, saying we agreed on this percentage of codes. And if you're saying, there are a couple of different ways you can do this. It's been tricky for us because we might apply multiple codes to the same response. So we could have more than one disagreement per response, for example, or more than one agreement per response. So we've had to get a little bit more sophisticated about the math there. The advantages I see is there are fewer assumptions. It's pretty straightforward and transparent to calculate a percentage agreement. And you can apply it to the coding scheme as a whole and say, our agreement for this set of codes applied to this set of responses was something like 80%. And I've done that for some things, and some reviewers of papers have said, why didn't you do Cohen's kappa or something like that? And it was a matter of writing back and saying, here are the reasons why I kind of just explained. Namely for me that I didn't think the codes were independent at that point. Here's how I've calculated percentage agreement when coders can have more than one disagreement per response. If it was just, we agreed on 80% of responses, that would be pretty straightforward. But in the actual case, we took sort of a normalized total percentage of disagreement. So we took the total number of disagreements over the entire data set and divided that by the total possible codes we could have assigned. And that was how we calculated percentage agreement. Okay, so once you've done that, you might have, I'm not saying that those are the only 2 ways you could do this sort of thing, but those are the ways that I've done it and seen other people do it, or variations of that. But once you've done that, there are a couple of different places you could go from there. Eventually, I think, we want to report some percentage of like, X% of students said this thing and X% of students said this other thing or something like that. But depending on what your inter-rater agreement was and kind of what the venue you're looking to present your results in is, etc., it might make sense to make different choices. For example, when I've done this sort of process, with new folks who are just learning how to do this kind of research. It often makes sense to, well, let me back up a second. You know, you'll get your agreement out of the R or whatever. You come up with some number and you can either decide that's good enough. We're going to go ahead and report final percentages and leave it as it is. I don't expect that we would ever have 100% agreement because human beings are doing this work. And so typically for me in my research, if the percentage agreement is above about 85% or the kappa is above, you know, 0.8 or something like that, we usually say, you know what, this is pretty solid agreement, and we're comfortable just kind of leaving that as it is. And then what we've done is reported only the percentage of responses where both coders agreed that it was some code or another. For other situations, like if I'm trying to make an argument that something is less prevalent than someone else has already reported it to be, then I might actually report the percentage of responses where at least one coder assigned it some code, because that's kind of like the highest number that it could be, etc. If your percentage agreement is low, or you have a venue that you're trying to be really rigorous, you might calculate an inter-rater agreement of some kind and use that to actually assess, before you've done the whole data set, whether you have good enough agreement. Maybe you calculate inter-rater agreement after you've done 20% of the data, and then you come back, discuss between the two coders, revise your disagreements, and then code the rest from there, and then calculate inter-rater agreement again after that. Or in situations where I've got new folks or kind of a new coding scheme that's a little more tricky and we haven't gotten as good of agreement as we would like, another option that has worked well for us in like PERC proceedings or something like that is taking your initial percentage agreement and then having the two coders, or however many coders, discuss their disagreements and resolve them all. And that adds another level of reliability. Then you're reporting, these are the codes where we ultimately came to agreement through discussion with, and that's sort of like, you know, a preliminary step that you can get your work out there without going back to the drawing board. And that is a particularly good option, I think, when you're still in the process of refining a coding scheme or refining kind of how you're looking at the data. Okay, switching gears a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about video analysis because I think this is a lot of fun and something that a lot of grad students or self wanted to know a lot more about. And when I got started in video research, I thought there's got to be some rigorous way to do it, and I feel like I'm just making stuff up. And so I did a bunch of research, and what I've come to is there is a rigorous way, but it is not the same kind of rigor as like a large N quantitative study where you're controlling variables and have this, it's just a much more iterative and fluid process, I guess. And I think it's important to note that for me, at least, I think video research or video analysis is better suited to certain kind of questions than others. And there are some kinds of research questions that really you can only answer with video data or something of that nature. So for example, a research question that I tackled with video data is what knowledge, skills, or dispositions might support instructors in effectively implementing resources-oriented instruction in a university physics course. So this question is really asking about what helps instructors in real time in a classroom. And so having classroom data is going to be much more important. This was also at kind of the early stages of understanding our instructional materials development. And so I think for my research team, video analysis has been a really fruitful method for rigorous hypothesis generation, kind of a way of doing observational experiments that we can later, that we can learn from and figure out what the best way to actually quantitatively test something would be. video data, I think, is also really good for answering questions about like mechanisms in a learning sense. How do things unfold, or how does this worksheet or intervention that I've designed actually help students to improve their conceptual understanding, or something like that might be a good question for video analysis. Anyways, so for me, this process is rather cyclical and iterative, but generally it looks something like this. First, I would start by collecting the video data, and often I might have broad research questions in mind. I want to know something about how this instructional material works, or I want to know something about how students interpret my questions or their experience in the classroom. And what those broad research questions are might influence how I collect the data. In this stage, it's kind of important to be thinking about, you know, where do I actually want to position the cameras? What kind of audio quality do I need? And do I need video of kind of the whole classroom, or of individual students or tables? Do I need to be able to see what they're writing on a whiteboard or something like that? Those all can be considerations that I have learned are much better to make at that stage than to be several stages later and wishing I could see what they wrote on the whiteboard, having no idea. But you can still work with it. And I also think it's important to say that I have been involved in a lot of research projects where we used video data that was initially collected for a totally different reason, but we knew had some of the features that we were looking for in a different research project. So once you have the data, typically what I do is I content log the videos, which I think is a really great preliminary analysis step because it saves a lot of time transcribing, and because it's a really great way to kind of get a sense of the whole data set and where the interesting pieces might be without spending tons and tons of time trying to analyze every piece first. So when I content log, I typically watch the video and in real time make notes of just what is happening in the video every like minute or so, or when whatever is happening changes. So, you know, at 1 minute, the students are reading the worksheet silently. And then at 1 minute and 30 seconds, they start to discuss question A. And then at 3 minutes, they get on this off-topic conversation about what they're going to do this weekend, et cetera, et cetera. And then I have this log that I can go back to months later, or I could share with a collaborator, or I can use for myself. That's like, here's what's going on in this video, and I can choose later what segments of that video might be interesting for whatever purposes I'm interested in. At that point, I'm also kind of flagging. I usually use just yellow highlighter in whatever document I've got to highlight interesting episodes. And when I mean interesting, I literally mean just whatever seems interesting for whatever reason. I'll try to write a little bit of why I think it's interesting, but I'm not necessarily being super methodical about what I'm looking for at that point. Just like, oh, this conversation I found really fascinating, or this seems like there might be some resources related stuff going on. It's pretty loose at that point. And then once I've identified some episodes that I'm interested in doing a more careful analysis of, that's when I start the process of sort of an iterative close analysis of smaller chunks of the video and refining the claims that I'm making. And often the way this looks in at least my research group is bringing a clip of video to a group meeting or to a meeting with some other people and saying, I think this is interesting for X reason. I'm hoping we can watch it, and I just want to know what stands out to you in this clip. And that's usually how it starts. And then this is often the step where I transcribe a small segment of my video, because then I've kind of narrowed it down to usually like 5 to 10 minutes, and it's much more manageable to actually go in and type out all the words. I have not had success with automatic transcribing things yet. Maybe Zoom will change that, but when it's like in a classroom with background voices and they've like got slinkies in there, it's just like, it's not worth my time to try and like correct the robot, you know? Anyways, that's an aside about transcribing. I think something that I've learned about this process of kind of refining the analysis and making claims is often the work that I'm doing in that process is connecting between what's happening in this episode and the theory around whatever I'm interested in. So I'm kind of trying to answer the question of what is this episode or this piece of video a case of, and connecting to the theory. The theory says X thing, here's an example going on of that thing, and here's what we can learn from that. And so in this sense, the sort of generalizability is based on how your particular unique episode represents what's going on in the theory and might lend new insights or suggest, you know, different directions for research, or suggest particulars of the experience that can't really be answered with large N aggregate stuff. And these references at the bottom probably say all of those things much better than I could. I think those are some of my favorites for just kind of learning about what kinds of questions that video research is really good at answering, and the perspective on causality and generalizability, and just sort of the process of making visible what I'm seeing in this video and how that is a case of something that somebody else might want to know about. Yeah, so that's pretty much my perspective on the video research I've done. Is it's sort of this iterative process of just trying to make visible what I'm seeing in the video, and drawing on the theory to support those claims and to extend those claims, or I'm extending the theory, etc. And at this point, I'm interested to know what questions you all have, particularly like, well, if you have any questions for me, and also kind of, I'm interested to know how what I've said interacts with the research that you all do. Whether these seem familiar, boring, I like, it's in the back of my mind that somebody's like, why would you do it that way? Which is possibly valid. Don't want to discount that. These may not be the best methods, depending on, you know, how you do it. Grace says it's familiar to her. That's because she works with me. So yeah, I want to open up to the audience at this point anyways.
Cool, thank you so much, Lisa. All right, so yeah, so I guess if you don't mind, I can go ahead and moderate the questions. So if there's anybody in the audience that would like to type out a question, or you can feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you, or Lisa can call on you. If not, I can go ahead and ask the first question. I'll give it some time. No. We got a hand from Drew.
Thank you, Lisa. I don't know how to put my hand down. I'll figure it out in a second. Yeah, so I've done a bit of qualitative research myself, and I guess what we've done a lot of interviews. So I guess my first question is, have you thought about doing any follow-up interviews with students, like one-on-one interviews, beyond just sort of video analysis of their interactions?
Yeah, so in my research, we have definitely used interviews before for a couple of different purposes. And I guess in what I've done so far, they've usually been kind of like earlier on in the process. So we've used a lot of interviews to try and understand if we're asking these conceptual questions to elicit resources and then later do large N research on that. We've done interviews to understand whether students actually interpret the questions the way we intend them to. And that's often also really interesting because they're answering the questions in real time. So that has been helpful for kind of figuring out how resources might build on each other or are elicited in conjunction with each other, et cetera. We've also done some interviews recently to understand students' experiences in the classroom and how they see that, like, trying to understand whether they see their ideas as being built upon in the classroom or sort of as obstacles, we have not figured out the right questions to ask to get at those questions. For students.
Like basically trying to figure out like why did you choose these did you consciously choose these resources, or is there some sort of subconscious type of thing, like you're just sort of, it's going on, the assembly goes on in the background and then just the finished product comes out, or is there some sort of conscious assembly of various resources to come up with some sort of solution to that? Is that, sorry,
Yeah.
does it make any sense at all? If it didn't make any sense, it's fine.
No, I think it makes sense. What we're really trying to figure out right now is, so with the instructional materials side of things, we have this hypothesis that instructional materials that build on students' ideas rather than, say, trying to adjust misconceptions might kind of lend themselves to different affective experiences. And so we're trying to figure out how to ask students questions like, did you notice that we were building on the ideas that you already had? Or did you feel like your ideas were valuable for your learning in this situation? But the problem is that a lot of students, when we ask them, like, were your ideas valuable? They're kind of narrowly looking at, like, I already learned X thing in my high school physics class, for example, and that was useful because I already knew the information, or that was not useful because I like had it wrong. And that's not, yeah. So this is another way that interviews have been useful to me, at least, is figuring out like, oh, this is not quite the right question to be asking.
So I guess it's just a quick follow-up to that. I guess, I don't know if this can be quick. I guess, are you looking at all at the creation of resources? Like, are you either looking for that within the video analysis and watching sort of resources being built, being generated in real time, or are you perhaps during some interviews, are you asking sort of resources, where did these ideas come from? Or is that just not, is that not relevant to your body of work?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the theory a little bit. Resources theory kind of suggests that like resources are created in people's minds from really early ages. So if we wanted to ask like, where did these resources come from? We'd probably have to be studying like babies or something, and probably the whole range, like it would be this amazing psychology process. The piece of that we do look at more often is like when, for example, in a classroom or in an interview, student activates this idea that I recognize as one of my resources. How does that get refined or built upon, or like generalized or extended, or maybe like limited? Somebody realizes this resource is not useful in this context, so I'm not going to use it anymore. We are kind of looking at that unfolding in a shorter time span. Cool.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read the comment that Brianna Hansen posted. It says, we used inter-rater agreement for a PERC project, and I remember wondering about the independence of resources. So I appreciate the explanation behind using inter-rater agreement over Cohen's Kappa. Good job, Lisa.
Cool. Yeah, I worked with Brenna on that project. So yeah, we had a couple of different inter-rater agreement methods in that set of PERC papers, which is one of the reasons actually that I wanted to talk about that, because it basically just would really suck if you did all of this work to code things and like didn't meet whatever standard for agreement and then had to like scrap it and go back to the drawing board. I think that especially for new folks coming into the field, that's like not necessarily, well, I don't want that to be the message that you get, is that like,
yeah,
the rigor demands that you do all of that work.
Right. That's, yeah. So I think Danny has another question.
I just wanted to say I did 150 hours of observations and then sort of did some inter-rater reliability tests at the end of that were not, you know, kappa equals 0.8 or 85% reliability. And then it was sort of a like, oh my goodness, how can we salvage this? It was really scary. I had two questions, and I think they're kind of the same thing. The first is like, I was wondering if you'd tell me a little bit about your thoughts on positionality when you're sort of developing or coming up with these codes, and then also like, how do you share that out when you write papers? And then I was also wondering, because you say that you look for these things and you look for what's interesting, right? But I'm wondering how you get a sense for what's interesting and like how you develop like your nose for the good stuff. And then maybe does that depend a little bit on your positionality?
Yeah, I think so. To me, the most obvious piece of positionality that comes in both of these things is like my identity and training as a physicist. Like there's basically, despite the fact that I am trying to do this research project that says students' ideas are valuable even if they're not canonically correct, there's this piece that I feel like I can never really get away from, that I am seeing what students write from the lens of a physicist and like my knowledge of physics. And so as I'm interpreting, this is what I think the idea is, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that that is shaped by my physics understanding. And similarly, when I'm looking at video data and what's interesting, that is, I think, really shaped by my understanding and my like expectations of what should be happening in a classroom. And particularly when I get excited about like, it really seems like the students are learning here. I think that that is really, really influenced by both like what I think learning counts as like a physics teacher. Like I really want to see them interacting with each other. And I also want to see their ideas getting more sophisticated, kind of as measured by like my knowledge of physics, basically. So I think that's like, it's just, I don't know, I can't get away from that. And I think that similarly, there are so many other like pieces of my own identity that are more hidden to me that go into that. And so, yeah, I think this is, it lends itself to really long papers because it's addressing like, here's the demographics of our sample and here's our positions, and yeah, but it's important.
Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, so then we have Jason May who has a question as well. We can start off with the first one. How is your work similar to or influenced by the knowledge in pieces, PPRIMS, theoretical framework from DeSessa?
Yeah, so it is definitely very influenced by DeSessa's work. And I think that's like one of the primary like theoretical inputs into my own understanding of resources, both the PPRIMS paper, and there's another one called Misconceptions Reconceived, some other stuff. And I think that one especially is really influential to the work I do. I think that the difference here is the conceptual resources that I have reported are much more concrete and like physics specific, and therefore perhaps like a little bit more advanced in the path of like getting towards scientific knowledge than PPRIMS, which are often like the fundamental building blocks that are kind of abstracted and apply to tons and tons of situations. So I think sometimes the things we report are like reminiscent of PPRIMS or like maybe have PPRIMS baked into them, but they're perhaps more sophisticated or larger scale chunks of knowledge.
Yeah, and the second part of the question is if you were aware of research that focuses on the practice-oriented resources rather than conceptual.
I know about some research that has looked at like procedural resources for math, like resources having to do with coordinate systems and like integration and that sort of stuff. And I think that's similar. I'm not really aware, and there's also a lot of research that looks at epistemological resources, which are like pieces of knowledge that tells you like what kind of thing is going on or what kind of knowledge is expected here. But I don't know how much of that is specific to like lab stuff. But I suspect that would be a good place to start.
Thank you for that. All right, and then we have Constance. She says, I have also used WET's AC1 to interpret inter-rater reliability with co-coding. It is similar to Cohen's kappa, but it is robust with low trait prevalence if coders did not code a lot. Were you in the classroom while the students were being recorded? If not, how do you think not being there might influence your framing?
Part A, I don't know too much about WET's AC1, but I want to look into it because that seems like an interesting third opportunity. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Was I in the classroom while students were being recorded? In some cases, yes. Like we have recorded in classes that I was teaching. And then I was not the one who was asking them to be video recorded. It was kind of like I'm the instructor and then there's other researchers doing the video recording, but obviously like I had knowledge of the materials and stuff. And we've also done it in classrooms where I was not the instructor and was just like there to like press the button to turn on the camera and then told students that there were cameras there and left. I think that it seems like students forget that the video is on after a pretty short amount of time. Although maybe not fully, I don't know. But I think that the thing that maybe influences their framing is whether they, like I think in the classes I taught, there was different expectations of like what was going to happen with the worksheet, for example, or like if I was going to tell them the correct answer, or like I think there are other differences in framing associated with me, but not necessarily because I was the video recorder or not.
Yeah, I don't know if you mind if I add a little bit, because I guess like I've been all over the place. Like right now I'm looking at videos that I've transcribed, so I feel your pain if you've been transcribing videos. I totally just finished my bit of doing that. And then, but like when we were doing classroom, like doing the classroom data collection, I was in the classroom live coding. And so like that was a really interesting experience, but we also collected like we audio recorded, like we do the TAs. So we're looking at what the TAs are doing in the classroom. So we're able to mic them up and listen to what they're doing and whatnot. But like I've been noticing like, and I also feel your pain, Danny, of like, oh my gosh, we're so far in, what's going on with like our reliability? Because I'm going back and listening to that audio and I'm looking at the logs and I'm like, wait a minute, we didn't code this here, but this is definitely in this 2-minute interval. So like, what do I do here? So I was just curious what like your perspective of like video, like doing the video coding with the classroom observation was like. So that's so I figured I'd just give you like a little context of why I asked that.
Yeah, that seems like actually a really different process than what I've been doing. Because I guess in my research, this is maybe weird, but I haven't actually done a lot of like distinct coding of video transcript in a long time. Like most of it has been more at like an utterance level of like narrating, you know, the student says this and we're seeing X resource, but not necessarily just going through and kind of coding for some behavior or resource. And I think, I don't even know if that's like related to your question, but anyways, yeah, I feel like if I were live in the classroom coding, that would be really advantageous as a researcher, because then I'm like, it's like as close to when it's happening as possible. But also I do think that it just intuitively seems like that might influence how students or TAs are behaving in the classroom, because they know, and it's like much more obvious that they're being observed. like, I think when with the video cameras, there's always, I've found it's best to like tell students like, yes, there's a video camera in this corner. Here's what's going to happen with it. You can ignore it if you want to. And then usually there's like one moment where they're like looking at it and like smiling or something, or they'll like say something and be like, oh my gosh, we're on camera. But for the most part, they just like say whatever they're going to say.
Yes. Yeah, so I have a question that kind of brings up these topics, and it also brings up this whole discussion of forgetting the cameras there, right? So video analysis seems to rely heavily on what we see. And we ask for consent as to what we're allowed to see. And I wonder about those instances in which there's things that are not there for us to see, such as like, I mean, you talk about the context specificity of resources, and I would assume that somebody's race and gender would be some of that relevant context. Though I don't know if we would, like, did you ask for consent to discuss the people's perceived gender? Or did we ask or did we like ask for their gender or race in advance? So like there's this like ethics involved in which this consent seems to be necessary to be ongoing, right? Because like you also mentioned how some people may forget and some people do forget that the camera is there. Are those actions still consentful? You know, it's like if even though like they may have forgotten. So like this discussion of ethics is really heavy on my mind, and I wonder to what extent did you consider ethics when recording these videos?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And there are definitely things that I, like in hindsight with some of the videos, wish I would have done differently. Particularly, I wish I would have asked students what pseudonyms that they would choose for themselves, basically, if I were to use them, like the video with them in research. I have sort of in video research where it's like really specific to a student, I have sort of shied away from making inferences about how gender or race might affect the like what's going on with the resources. So like I've typically reported like, here's the demographics of the classroom or the class that I'm recording aggregately, and then you know, like if I am looking at the student's name, I will try to choose a common name that reflects the same heritage. But I wish I would have asked students what pseudonym they would prefer, because that's kind of like, I don't know if that's a good way to go about it, basically. But I feel like there's a really tricky thing in saying like, it's potential that these identities affect what resources are activated, but at the same time, I feel like there's so much more harm that can be done in associating those two things together. And so I've also kind of like, we've reported the demographic data and then sort of shied away from that in discussions of context sensitivity, because we just like, we don't know, and making the association or suggesting association seems potentially more harmful than not.
Yeah, and it's like I think shying away kind of puts you like in this with like you don't really want to get close to it, but it's more of like, you know, like I intentionally don't want to get there. Like I don't want to make these conclusions, right? So like to some extent you do hold yourself accountable, right? But it's very hard. It seems such a very hard to disentangle those. So yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. That was really on my mind heavy.
Yeah, I feel like the ethics thing, exactly. It's like, it's really, really tricky. And I just humbly offered, this is what we've tried as like transparency, basically, not because I am confident that it's the right way to go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're at into the 8th hour, into the next hour. So we're actually going to start wrapping up the discussion. I see there is some discussion going in the chat, so maybe y'all can continue that discussion in the Slack channel. That would be a great opportunity for that to continue. Lisa, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you for sharing this presentation and really sharing all these resources. I know a lot of us have been doing similar research and have been doing similar types of things, so we totally feel the frustrations. So again, thank you so much for being here and sharing those with us. Again, we're gonna have our next talk is going to be with Eric Kuhl. I actually don't know the details as to what he will be discussing, but we will be posting those up. Um, Again, we were able to get Lisa's email, so if you have any questions for her, feel free to email her. You can also look her up online, or if not, just go ahead and email us and we can put you in contact. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here. Really appreciate you.